The government is still set to propose other difficult reforms to disability benefits, like tightening the criteria for new claimants, alongside measures to make it easier for people on benefits to get back into work.
So, Carl, the government's still likely to be proposing things that many of its own MPs will be very unhappy with.
Yeah, because this is one of the most difficult things in the government's in-tray. Sickness and disability benefits were costing us about £40 billion a year before the pandemic. By the end of this decade, we're looking at something like £100 billion a year. Now, there's disagreement about why that huge increase is happening. Increasingly, it's young people who are qualifying. Increasingly, it's because of mental health conditions. In fact, somewhat controversially today, Wes Streeting suggested that doctors were over-diagnosing mental health conditions. Campaigners will argue that it's actually because mental health services and treatments are under-resourced. But one thing that everyone can agree on is that this kind of huge increase is...
In the lead-up to the controversy, Rachel Reeves, the Labour Party's shadow Chancellor, stood with unwavering confidence, prepared to defend a bold new policy aimed at balancing the nation's budget. The proposal was clear: freezing personal independence payments, PIP, a critical benefit for millions of disabled people across the UK, in an attempt to reclaim a staggering £5 billion from the welfare budget. At the heart of the plan was the idea that the welfare system had grown unsustainable, and it was time for Labour to show fiscal responsibility. Reeves, a trusted figure within Labour's economic team, presented this as a necessary step for long-term economic stability. With her usual poise, she argued that this was not a reckless decision, but a well-considered move to restore balance to the UK's finances. Behind closed doors, however, the Labour leadership was already preparing for potential fallout. Starmer's team had anticipated some level of resistance, but they never expected the scale of backlash this proposal would provoke. What was meant to be a quiet, calculated policy shift soon began to stir a political storm, one that would unravel not only Labour's economic strategy, but also the unity of its leadership in the months to come.
Talk, James, first of all about this benefits cut situation, which we're going to hear more of at about lunchtime today.
Well, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves war on the British people in order to protect the wealth of the super-rich continues today, picking on sick and disabled people.
But James, could I ask you why? Could I ask you
why are they doing it?
Yeah, bear in mind, I mean, this really puzzles me. This is a socialist government.
No, it's not.
What are they then? Because they're the Labour Party. They're supposed to represent the working man, the working person.
They're supposed to, but I think Health Secretary and darling of Keir Starmer's Labour Party, Wes Streeting, summed it up pretty well in Parliament the other day when he listed a whole series of unpleasant, anti-people things that the government was doing, and then goaded the Tories saying, you wanted to do these things, but we're really doing it.
As the details of the disability benefit freeze started to leak, the backlash grew faster than anyone had anticipated. Labour's internal divisions began to surface almost immediately. Left-wing MPs, who had long been the backbone of the party's social justice rhetoric, felt betrayed by a policy that seemed to target the most vulnerable members of society. Voices of rebellion grew louder, with prominent figures like Angela Rayner and Ed Miliband speaking out against the freeze, calling it an outright attack on the party's core values. But it wasn't just the senior figures that were upset. The rebellion spread quickly to the backbenches. Dozens of Labour MPs, many of whom had been staunch supporters of Starmer until now, voiced their dismay. They were furious that a party which once promised to defend the weakest in society was now seemingly complicit in their suffering. The public, too, was quick to react. Disability rights groups took to the streets in large numbers, while social media erupted with hashtags like "Stop the Cups" and "Hands off PIP," demanding that Labour reverse its decision. As the protests intensified, the political storm began to feel unstoppable. What was meant to be a quiet policy change had now sparked a full-scale revolt, and the leadership of the Labour Party was hanging by a thread.
It is in no way a socialist government. It's not one that is pursuing, what you would call basic Labour values. It's one that is continuing cuts and austerity against the majority of people. It's finding ever new ways to pick our pockets. And it's doing all of it because it doesn't want to either break with the militarism that is demanded upon us by the US, or to tax the wealth of the very super rich, who have got hugely richer over the last 15 years. And instead, it's going to drive 700,000 people with disabilities into poverty. That's after cutting the winter fuel allowance for pensioners.
The internal chaos within the Labour Party escalated as the backlash to the disability benefit freeze became too loud to ignore. What started as whispers of discontent turned into open rebellion. Left-wing MPs, longtime allies of Starmer, began openly criticising the policy. They accused him of betraying Labour's values and abandoning the party's traditional commitment to social justice. Angela Rayner, known for her passionate defence of the vulnerable, was one of the first to speak out, vocally opposing the freeze and declaring it a dangerous move. Ed Miliband, still an influential figure within the party, joined in, warning that the freeze could cost Labour dearly in the next general election. But it wasn't just the usual critics. Moderate and centrist MPs who had been loyal to Starmer were also shaking their heads in disbelief. Some even threatened to break ranks, signalling that the rebellion was gaining momentum and would soon become a full-scale political crisis. Outside the confines of Westminster, the pressure mounted as disability rights groups flooded social media with personal stories of how the cuts would devastate disabled individuals. The uproar reached new heights as Starmer and his team scrambled to manage the fallout, unsure whether they could quell the storm that was now threatening to tear the party apart.
Instead of sitting there sort of ruminating about your situation, how much were they thinking that they might save or get out of making, not freezing by freezing this payment?
I don't have the exact number, Nana, but I would presume a fair amount, because ultimately you are looking at inflation has risen. So if you were to freeze it, you would be able to save a fair amount, potentially in the billions. And I think that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is going out there and saying that we need to grow the economy for things to improve in this country. But also have a look at what the government's spending. That should be the first step. We need to have something like Elon Musk is doing in the US, maybe not as stringent, but something along those lines that enables us to look where there is waste in government spending, and the welfare bill is the first place they should be looking, because we are spending far too much.
As the political crisis surrounding Labour's disability benefit freeze reached its peak, the party's handling of the situation was becoming a spectacle of indecision and public outcry. Rachel Reeves, once a confident advocate for the policy, found herself repeatedly called out in public debates, struggling to defend a decision that had rapidly turned into a political landmine. During a particularly tense live television appearance, she was confronted by an emotional disabled woman who asked a simple, gut-wrenching question: "Do you know what it's like to choose between heating and eating?" The room fell silent, and the audience, overwhelmingly sympathetic to the woman's plea, erupted in applause. Reeves, visibly uncomfortable, tried to deflect the harshness of the moment with political jargon, but the damage was done. Social media exploded with outrage, and the hashtag "Labour has abandoned us" went viral, symbolizing the public's complete disillusionment with the party's stance. Despite the growing pressure, Reeves stubbornly doubled down in interviews, attempting to justify the freeze as a necessary step for economic stability. But her words only fueled the anger. Meanwhile, the Labour leadership, caught between the rebellion within the party and a growing public outcry, scrambled to contain the fallout. But it seemed increasingly clear that the damage to Labour's reputation was irreversible.
Starmer started this appeal to Labour MPs last night at a meeting of backbenchers and Labour peers. He had a few tricky questions there. He told them that the welfare system as it works at the moment was indefensible and unfair, but there's clearly a feeling at the top of the Labour machine that reception wasn't good enough in there, and there is trouble ahead, because Keir Starmer is taking the extremely unusual measure of calling in every Labour MP who isn't a minister into number 10 over the next 2 days to try to persuade them face to face that actually they need to back these £5, maybe £6 billion worth of welfare cuts that you were just describing. I reckon he's carved out about 5 hours from his diary, not allowing for prep time to do this. This doesn't happen very often, and I think it's happening because some of these measures, not all of them, but some of them need to be passed in a vote in the House of Commons. And people at the top of the Labour Party think the number of rebels currently, if they were guessing, that could be in their own ranks passing these.
In the aftermath of the intense backlash, Labour's leadership was left grappling with the consequences of their actions. The party's internal divisions were now impossible to ignore, and the pressure to backtrack on the disability benefit freeze was mounting. Despite Reeves' attempts to defend the policy, public opinion was shifting dramatically, and the Labour Party's once unshakable lead in the polls was beginning to crumble. In an attempt to salvage what remained of the party's credibility, Starmer and his team started to subtly shift the narrative. Instead of outright admitting defeat, Labour issued a carefully worded statement that hinted at a review of the policy, signalling that they were considering a reversal. However, the damage had already been done. The public saw the U-turn not as a sign of strong leadership, but as an embarrassing capitulation under pressure. Labour's credibility was in tatters, with disability rights activists, MPs and the public all demanding more than just a policy reversal. They wanted genuine commitment to protecting the most vulnerable. Meanwhile, within Labour, murmurs of leadership challenges grew louder as Starmer's authority was increasingly questioned. His inability to navigate the crisis and assert control over his party left Labour exposed, weakening its chances in the upcoming election and threatening the future of both Starmer and Reeves. See you later.